So, this is it. Really? I mean, don't get me wrong, everything looks great. Nice layer cake of bears, guns, horses, and steel, topped with a frosting of ice. I certainly am not one to look a gift bear in the mouth. However, I do see some issues that give me pause. For those of you who don't know, Creative Assembly released the official roster reveal for Kislev. I will briefly go over the roster in a moment and talk about them in a multiplayer context, but I wanted to address some of my criticism up front. First, for those of us paying attention to the drip feed of info from CA, there's nothing new to see here. Everything in the roster reveal was already shown or at least hinted at in previous releases. I don't know why I expected to see something new here, but it does feel like a bit of a letdown. The roster also feels very small, so much so that I did a bit of digging. According to my calculations, and I am by no means a master math magician, this is the smallest roster of any playable base faction for any Warhammer game seen so far. Including weapon variations and different lores of magic, I counted about 27 units. Feel free to correct my math if I'm wrong here, but all the other Game 1 and 2 base factions had 30 plus units. Even if you count casters and weapon variants the same, Kislev probably still has the smallest roster. Beyond just the small size, Kislev seems to be very limited in variety for characters. Literally every character, even the Ice Queen, has the same mount set, just horse and bear. While having 2 brand new lores of magic is very cool, only having access to those 2 lores further limits variety. Only 2 heroes puts them on par with the Sad Beasts, who will likely get more in about a month or so, leaving Kislev behind. All this is rounded out by a tight design focus that provides plenty of benefits, but also means almost all units can be boiled down to hybrid missile/melee, cavalry, bears, or some combination of the 3. As I've said before, I'm a big fan of these designs aesthetically, and everything looks cohesive and fits the theme of the faction well, but this does contribute to the roster feeling even smaller than it actually is. The question is, what led to this? Some will point to Creative Assembly's DLC practices. I won't go too deep into that topic here. There is absolutely valid criticism there. Some will say it's because we are getting more starting factions this time, and there may be some truth to that, but I don't totally buy it, given we know at least part of each Chaos faction will be using recycled assets. The newness of Kislev might have something to do with that as well, but regardless, this is what we've got. I would implore Creative Assembly to take a second look at Kislev, especially in the character department, to see if they could quickly add anything to help fill out the roster. More mounts, like maybe a unique ice sled for Cavalry. Maybe they could add 1 or 2 of the common lores of magic that would fit with the theme of Kislev, like heavens or beasts. Even a bog standard generic melee hero would be welcome. I mean, just look how popular Bob is. Just something more to make the faction feel complete. This section turned out a little bit longer than I intended, so I'm going to skip the roster reveal itself, go watch Creative Assembly's video, or I'm sure any number of other content creators who have covered it in detail. Instead, let's go directly into multiplayer theory crafting. This part isn't scripted and likely won't be as polished on editing, so you've been warned. Starting with a general overview, I do see 2 potential issues cropping up for Kislev in multiplayer. First is what I like to call the high elf problem, which is that they don't appear to have any really low tier troops, or at least their low tier troops appear to be extremely limited. I think you have like 2 low tier troops, which are not even probably going to be that cheap, given that they are hybrid missile melee units, right? You've just got your basic Kossars, spears, and the regular ones, and that's it in terms of low tier infantry. So already this roster is looking pretty top heavy. I mean, you've got your cheapish cavalry and horse archers potentially as well, but again, this seems to me on the face of it to be very similar in the way that high elves are constructed, in that they have a hard time taking full 20 stacks because all of their units are relatively expensive. Now, granted, these are humans, right? So they'll probably have better HP overall, and their units likely are to be more cost-effective in general. That kind of remains to be seen. We don't have any hard, numbers to go off of here. But certainly it could be a little bit of an issue for them to field enough unit models. And sort of in relation to that, in multiplayer rule sets for tournaments and even on ladder, there's a maximum number of ranged units that you can take. Now, the fact that you're basic low-tier troops means that if you take an army with any sort of width, a good percentage of that maximum number of ranged units is going to be taken up automatically by your low-tier troops. And given that so many units in this roster are hybrid missile melee units, you are going to run into that max, I think it's max 12 ranged units in the standard banner tournament rules. You're going to run up against that limit fairly frequently, and it will be something you have to take into consideration when constructing your armies. In terms of the armored Kossars, the fact that they're armed with precursor pistols does make them count as ranged units in most rule sets. There are some rule sets that say, like, miners with blasting charges, for example, and skink cohort with javelins. Since they have, I think, only 1 or 2 ammo, they don't actually count as a ranged unit. We'll have to see with these armored Kossars how many volleys of the pistols they have. Maybe in some rule sets they won't be considered ranged units, but probably in ladder and on, your primary rule sets they will, which again means that another one of your potential mid-tier melee infantry units to help fill out your army will also count towards your maxed ranged units. So probably a lot of cavalry-heavy armies, which is nice to see. It does kind of bring me to the cavalry issue, and I'm hoping this is something that they can get fixed with balancing going into Game 3, but cavalry is not in a great place right now in Total War Warhammer. Those of you guys living under a rock and don't know, one of the main things is, and this is something they did talk about in their dev Q&A on Discord a little while ago, on the higher difficulties in campaigns, some of the melee buffs to the AI means that cavalry are basically just unusable completely, which is a little bit unfortunate from my understanding. I don't actually play those higher difficulties because of those ridiculous buffs, and they did say that they're going to be toning down the melee buffs that the AI gets on those higher difficulties to make more melee units viable, which I definitely am a big fan of. I think that's great. But more than that, even in multiplayer right now, cavalry's in a little bit of a weird place because of some of the mass changes they've done. Cavalry models tend to not have much more HP than infantry generally. I mean, it depends a lot on the type of infantry and the type of cavalry, but just as an example, I think Black Orcs, which are granted, I think, the most meaty infantry with the highest amount of HP, they have actually more HP than most cavalry models do, which, is interesting considering they have way more unit models. And again, I don't think, like, a mounted yeoman should probably, like, it makes sense that a single Black Orc probably has more health than an ill-fed Bretonnian riding a pony, basically, right? Like, that makes sense to me. But, an elite Grail Knight on his steed should probably have more HP than the Black Orc. I don't know. The overall HP scaling, I think, is one thing they could potentially do to help fix cavalry a little bit. Also, kind of going back and retuning, kind of fine-tuning some of the mass changes, make them a little bit better as well. And that is something that they'll have to get resolved for Kislev, because Kislev is going to rely on cavalry pretty heavily, it seems, from their roster construction. It is going to be very much sort of a hit-and-run style. This is something that you can sort of do right now with High Elves and Wood Elves, obviously. But you basically just have, like, your ranged units continuously shooting and scooting, right? Firing and then retreating and firing and retreating, and basically your cavalry in the meantime is running hit-and-run charges, kind of spreading your opponent out, stopping up advances. Maybe you have a few token melee infantry units to make a pitched defense when you need to. Especially like spears and stuff, but given that you don't have just straight up spear melee infantry, it could be a little bit tougher. Yeah, the playstyle is going to be very much that way. I do think in terms of rush, they could have a pretty powerful cavalry rush potentially. Characters, I gotta be honest, I totally I know I'm being very, very critical in this video, which yeah, it's mostly because I'm so passionate about this game. But Constantine looks very good, and depending on how the nerfs to healing go through fire damage, you know, he's not going to be as good as he would have been previously, but the fact that he's a healer and also has buffs, probably a decent melee combatant on a bear as well. It's hard to say without seeing him in action. But Constantine plus a Patriarch, I think, is going to be a go-to for a lot of people. It'll give you 2 healers with non-magic based healing, so you can still take a caster with plenty of damage output. As a result of that, I unfortunately don't think Katarine will be that competitive in multiplayer. I mean, she's got her little ice explosion, which is nice, and she'll be probably the best caster of any of the Kislev casters. Allows you to take your caster and lord in one, which provides some benefit as well, but man, making Constantine a healer is just makes him automatically the more competitive choice in many people's eyes, even with the nerfs to healing. Katarine, I mean, the fact that you can take the same lores of magic, you know, in a generic lord or in heroes, yeah, I don't know. I know they're already retuning the magic system somewhat for Game 3. We'll see. Maybe they'll do more to help differentiate the legendary casters and incentivize you more for taking them. Certainly, depending on how the spells work as well for Lore of Ice. Yeah, I mean, Katarine could be good for an offensive caster, like a really heavily damage-focused caster against certain factions, especially if they have a lot of fire damage, where healing may not be necessarily as effective. But I do think Constantine, unfortunately, will be the most likely pick in multiplayer. We'll have to wait and see. I mean, all of this is still pretty early on, obviously, and I have got a chance to play just a tiny little sliver of it in a very controlled manner in that demo before. And it's, you know, because of the health scaling on the corn unit, it's really not a great indication of how things will play, but certainly gives us an idea of how things will look and feel. I guess maybe we should go over some highlights, huh? Let's talk about some positive things. I do love the fact, I mean, rules-wise, it is kind of a punch in the shins, right? For the armored Kossars to have the precursor pistols, but for unit design, me personally, you know, as a fan of pistols and gunpowder and aesthetically, I love it. I have to say, I absolutely love it. That was definitely a highlight for me in there. Kossovite dervishes also, again, I don't think this is a unit that we ever saw directly, but I don't actually have a picture of it here. No idea what it looks like when I'm recording this, but I'm assuming it's literally just the horse archers with melee weapons. Yeah, lots of great cavalry. The 2 versions of the war sleds, I'm curious to see if there's a major difference in them aesthetically. I think we only saw the 1 variant in the trailer. I don't know, I'll have to go back and check, but yeah, they should be pretty solid, depending on the cost and the speed and some other things. Probably just going to be straight up better than war wagons, but we'll see. Snow Leopard is another one that I'm curious to see how it works out. Generally, the cheap single entities are very good. So stuff like, you know, manticores, like the, I always forget the mini rat thing. Not the hell pit, but the smaller one. Why can I not remember the name? Anyway. Small, cheap single entities, you know, like your Tomb Scorpion, you know, Manticore, stuff like that, is generally pretty good in the meta right now. That may change with some of the, like, wounds and some other stuff, but the Snow Leopard could be a very cost-effective option to help you take that terror in a wide army. Again, we need to look and see what the stats will be, but definitely, like, the speed from what we saw in the trailers seems to be at least on par with, you know, heavy cavalry, possibly even faster. Granted, Kislev's heavy cavalry's very fast already, so keeping up with them, I can definitely see some strong builds with, like, mobile cav rushes using these Snow Leopards, assuming they cause terror as a nice little terror bomb piece. Yeah, it says here, extremely fast and very capable. Okay, so should be able to support those cavalry engagements quite well, which I'm a big fan of. The Elemental Bear, big expensive monsters are in a little bit of a weird place right now in multiplayer as well, so hopefully they get some, you know, updates to make them a little bit more usable, but definitely a very cool unit. How good will it actually end up being? It's hard to say. If it is actually unbreakable like it was in the demo, That in and of itself is very strong. It's a big, expensive single entity that won't run away, so you can dump plenty of healing resources into it and make sure you won't lose out on that. Yeah, definitely interesting to see how that will go. The Kislev, I'm wondering how they're going to hold up against factions which can outshoot them. I think they could potentially have a little bit of a tough time, like into, say, Empire, Vampire Coasts, Dwarfs. For factions which can reliably outshoot them, definitely going to have to rely on cavalry rushes more, and granted, with the bear chariots kind of providing more of a disruption than what you have with Empire, because like with Empire war wagons, in that type of rush situation, you really don't have great disruption tools, other than, say, maybe some magic, or trying to make a play with your light cavalry, but even then, Pistoliers at 500 points aren't ridiculously cheap. The war wagons aren't functional chariots where they can kind of disrupt, break through enemy lines. You don't have any monstrous infantry or anything like that, so it can actually be somewhat hard to disrupt missile lines. I definitely think Kislev will have to rely on that when playing into those heavier missile factions. I'm also curious to see, like, I don't know, just thinking about matchups on paper, what else could potentially be one of the tougher matchups for them? And then on the flip side, if like Khorne, for example, I know in trailers we've seen mostly Kislev beating up Khorne, but in an actual battle, like in an actual multiplayer battle, I think if you scale heavily enough into the melee rush, that you may just be able to overpower Kislev, because they are kind of sitting in that hybrid role. I think most of the balanced factions and most of the like kind of rush / balanced factions, like the Greenskins probably will have some issues with them. Assuming Greenskins get balanced, which they no doubt will. Yeah, like a lot of the factions could have a pretty even matchup with them, honestly, but I could see like Khorne maybe giving them some fits. Vampire Counts is another one that, actually missile melee units can be good against the Vampire Counts. Kind of depends on their stats. If the low tier trash units for vampires can get hits on them, they probably won't do very well against Vampire Counts. If their stats are good enough that the low tier trash can't get too many hits on them, and they can actually use their missile weapons and then also fend off, melee attacks, could be good. We'll see. I'm actually genuinely interested to get in and, multiplayer theory crafting speculation's one thing, but once the rubber hits the road, that's when we'll really figure out what's good. But definitely can think of quite a few fun builds with, like, maybe like two wagons or 2 sleds, a variety of cavalry with maybe 1 or 2 snow leopards, probably just like a token line of probably like 6. Yeah, I'd probably go 6 Kossars with spears, maybe 2 armored Kossars for a little bit of a backbone, and then the rest would be all cavalry and mobile units, along with, yeah, whatever. Heroes. The hero stuff, the heroes and lords, a lot of it comes down to cost as well. Like, if the caster lord types are very cheap, then that could be very good. Then they might see some use if they're cheap enough. The Boyar's one that, I mean, he's just kind of here. I don't even know. In campaign, I mean, yeah, the Ice Witch can take the War Bear, so how much of an incentive is there to actually even take the Boyar as a lord? Will this guy ever see any use? Probably not, but we'll see. Anyway, I've rambled on long enough in this this section, so hopefully you guys enjoyed this. Let me know down in the comments below how you feel about the roster reveal in and of itself, how you feel about Kislev as a faction, how you think they'll play in multiplayer. I do think they could be pretty strong, but I think if a faction skews heavily in one direction or the other from that kind of melee to range gradient, I think they'll be able to overpower Kislev either with overwhelming shooting or overwhelming melee force. I think if you try and kind of cut a balance in between that, Kislev is going to be very strong in that situation, but we'll see. Let me know your guys' thoughts in the comments below. Hopefully you enjoyed this. If you like this sort of content, be sure to like, subscribe, hit that bell notification button. Every time I upload a new video, you'll be notified. Thanks again. We'll see you next time.